All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're tackling a really complex and, let's be honest, often controversial topic: the long history of the United States getting involved in changing foreign governments. It's a story that stretches back more than 150 years and has left its mark all over the globe. So let's get into it.
I want to start with just one number, 64. So what is that? Well, that's the number of covert, meaning secret, attempts at regime change the US was involved in just during the Cold War. And that's only one period in this long history. It's a figure that really kind of sets the stage for the scale of what we're about to explore.
Okay, so to make sure we're all on the same page, what do we actually mean by regime change? It's a pretty broad term, right? It covers any action a government takes, whether it's out in the open or totally behind the scenes, to alter or just straight up replace the leadership of another country. This could be anything from funding political opponents all the way to a full-blown military invasion.
To really get our heads around this, we're going to break this history down into three distinct eras. First, we've got the period of American expansionism. Then we jump into the ideological battlefield of the Cold War. And finally, we'll look at the world after the Soviet Union, what's often called the New World Order. Each of these periods had totally different motivations and, as you'll see, very different methods. So let's start at the beginning. Back in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, U.S. foreign policy was really all about securing territory, expanding its influence, and maybe most importantly, protecting its growing economic interests, especially right here in its own hemisphere. You can see a pretty clear pattern emerge when you look at these early interventions. In Hawaii, for instance, it was American business interests, the sugar trade, that drove the overthrow of the monarchy. Then in the Philippines, there's this great irony where the U.S. fought with revolutionaries to kick Spain out, only to then turn right around and crush their new republic to get a strategic foothold in the Pacific. And with Cuba and Nicaragua, you really see the start of this long history of intervening to protect American money and install friendly governments.
Okay, so after World War II, everything changes. The world map is fundamentally redrawn. Now U.S. intervention isn't just about regional dominance anymore. The motivation shifts to a massive global ideological struggle against a brand new rival, the Soviet Union and the spread of communism.
And the idea that really drove so many of these actions was this concept right here, the domino theory. The fear, and it was a very real fear in Washington, was that if just one country fell to communism, it would set off a chain reaction and the whole region would go with it. This theory became the go-to justification for intervening in countries way outside of America's traditional backyard.
This slide, it really captures the heart of the whole conflict. You had a clash of two superpowers with completely opposite visions for the world. The U.S. wanted to contain communism, the Soviet Union wanted to expand it. And this ideological showdown basically turned the entire planet into a giant chessboard, where smaller nations often became pawns in their much bigger game.
Now, how do you fight a war of influence when both sides have nuclear weapons? You can't risk a direct conflict, right? It could mean the end of the world. So the methods had to get a lot more subtle. This led to the rise of covert operations, and the brand new Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, became the main tool for carrying out U.S. foreign policy quietly, in the shadows.
And a textbook example of this new approach is the 1953 coup in Iran. The Prime Minister, Mossadegh, nationalized the country's oil industry, which had been controlled by the British. Well, the US and the UK worried this meant he was getting too cozy with the Soviets. So, through what they called Operation Ajax, the CIA and Britain's MI6 basically engineered a coup. They got rid of him and put the Shah firmly in power. This operation didn't just become a blueprint for future coups, it also planted these seeds of resentment that, decades later, would explode into the 1979 Iranian Revolution.
But here's the thing, Iran was just the start. That playbook they developed, it got used all over the world throughout the 1950s. In Guatemala, a democratically elected president was overthrown, not just because of communism fears, but also to protect the American-owned United Fruit Company. From failed coup attempts in Syria to backing rebellions in Indonesia, the U.S. strategy was pretty clear. Any government, even a democracy, that seemed unfriendly to American interests was a potential target.
So how did these operations actually work on the ground? Well, a kind of formula started to emerge. It usually started quietly by secretly funding opposition groups and newspapers to stir up dissent. Then came the economic pressure to try and create instability. That would be followed by supporting strikes and protests to create a sense of chaos. And the final step, more often than not, was to encourage and help a military coup to take power.
This quote, declassified years later, from President Nixon talking about Chile, wow, it is so telling. The target was Salvador Allende, a democratically elected Marxist. And the strategy wasn't just to oppose him, it was to literally make the economy scream, to tear his government apart from the inside. It just perfectly captures the cold, hard reality of using economic warfare as a tool for regime change.
Okay, let's jump forward to our final era. The Soviet Union collapses in 1991. The Cold War is over. But that didn't mean U.S. interventions were over. Nope. Instead, the reasons for them, and in many cases the methods, they just evolved again for a whole new world.
So the big threat of global communism was gone. In its place, new reasons for intervention started to pop up. The war on terror, especially after 9/11, became a massive driver. So did the idea of stopping the spread of weapons of mass destruction, or WMDs. And more, you started to see interventions framed as humanitarian missions, to protect civilians or to restore democracy.
And this table really shows some of the biggest interventions of the modern era, which have often shifted away from those sneaky, covert actions to massive, out-in-the-open military operations. In Haiti, the stated mission was to put the elected president back in power. The invasion of Afghanistan was a direct response to the 9/11 attacks. The 2003 Iraq War was publicly justified by the threat of WMDs. And the intervention in Libya was launched under a UN mandate to protect civilians. And this is a really crucial point to understand about this modern era. Just how open the goal of regime change became. This wasn't some secret plot anymore. I mean, look at the Iraq Liberation Act. It was passed years before the 2003 invasion, and it officially stated, right there in black and white, that removing Saddam Hussein was U.S. policy. That is a huge shift from the secret backroom nature of so many Cold War operations.
So as we start to wrap this up, let's pull back and look at the big picture. What is the legacy of this long, complicated history of intervention? What's the common thread, and what's really changed over time?
Ultimately, I think the whole story really boils down to this. The continuity is just undeniable. For over 150 years, there's been a consistent pattern of the U.S. intervening in the governments of other nations. That part hasn't changed. But the change is just as important. The reasons given for these interventions have shifted dramatically, from economics to fighting communism to the war on terror. And the methods have evolved right along with them, swinging from open occupation to secret coups and back again.
And that brings us, well, right up to today. We're in another period of huge global change, right? With new powers rising and new challenges facing everyone. So the question this history really leaves us with is this. As the world keeps shifting, how is this 150-year pattern of intervention going to evolve next? What will be the justifications and what will be the methods of the future? That's definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining me.